The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m. Not 4:45, not 5. Always 4:47, a habit Nathan Calloway had built around the specific number of minutes it took to make Lily's oatmeal before it turned gummy, before the day turned complicated, before the world outside their apartment started asking things of him. He wasn't sure he still had the energy to give. He lay there for 3 seconds, eyes open in the dark, listening to the buildings settle around him. They lived on the 6th floor of a modest complex on the east side of the city. The kind of building where the elevator made sounds that inspired no confidence, and the hallway carpets had been burgundy once, a long time ago, before life and foot traffic had dulled them to something closer to resignation. Nathan had chosen it precisely because the rent was low enough that he could manage on one income, and the school Lily attended was 4 blocks away. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there a moment, hands on his knees. There was a framed photograph on the nightstand. Claire, 7 years ago, laughing at something off camera, her red hair catching afternoon light in the way that used to stop his breath. It still did. He looked at it for exactly the amount of time he allowed himself, then stood. The kitchen was small. Everything about their life was small in square footage. But Nathan had made a discipline of making it feel intentional. The counters were clean. Lily's artwork, horses, mostly, and occasionally what appeared to be dragons with horse bodies, covered the refrigerator in a dense, cheerful mosaic. He ran water into the kettle, measured the oats, and sliced half a banana the way she liked it, in coins, not chunks. By the time the light under her bedroom door flickered on, her breakfast was waiting. Lily was 9 years old. She had her mother's red hair and her father's habit of speaking only when she had something worth saying. She came into the kitchen in her socks, sliding the last 3 feet across the linoleum in the way she'd done every morning since she learned she could, and climbed onto her stool with the practiced ease of someone who has performed the same ritual thousands of times. "Cold today?" she asked. "Probably." He set the oatmeal in front of her. "Your coat's by the door." She ate without looking up from the small library book she'd propped against the fruit bowl. Currently, she was working through a collection of folktales from around the world, the same library, Nathan had noticed, that had also given her a book of Japanese mythology, a slim volume of West African proverbs, and an illustrated guide to ancient Egyptian daily life. She consumed them with the same appetite she brought to breakfast and to everything else, steadily, without fuss, thoroughly. He dressed in the bathroom, pulling on the dark gray uniform with a small embroidered logo on the breast pocket. Calloway Building Services, it read. Though the building services in question were contracted by Hargrove Capital Group, one of the city's mid-tier private equity firms currently occupying floors 14 through 22 of a glass tower downtown, Nathan was part of the facilities crew. He cleaned offices, restrooms, conference rooms, and corridors. He ran a floor buffer on alternate Tuesdays. He changed light bulbs on a schedule and replaced soap dispensers before they ran empty, and ensured that the Hargrove Capital Group tower smelled like industrial lavender and nothing else. He had been doing this for 3 years. On the walk to Lily's school, she held his hand and told him about the folktale she was reading, a Slavic story about a man who was given 3 gifts and used only the third one wisely. Nathan listened carefully, as he always did, because Lily's observations had a way of landing somewhere precise and unexpected. "The first 2 gifts were faster," she said. "But the third one was quieter. And that's why he used it better?" She considered this. "I think so." The loud things made him impatient. He dropped her at the school gate, watched her disappear into the stream of backpacks and noise, then turned and walked to the subway. On the train, he stood near the doors with his bag and looked at nothing in particular. Around him, people in office clothes scrolled or stared or listened to things through earbuds. Nobody looked at him. This was not a new observation. In the uniform, he occupied a particular category of invisible necessary, in the way that clean floors are necessary, acknowledged only in their absence. He had made his peace with this years ago. Or something close to peace. At the tower, he badged in at the service entrance on the ground floor, collected his cart, and took the freight elevator to the 14th floor to begin. The day had a rhythm he knew without thinking. Empty the trash bins, wipe down surfaces, vacuum the common areas, mop the kitchen, restock. He worked from north to south on each floor, methodical, efficient. He had learned early that efficiency was a form of invisibility. The faster and cleaner you worked, the less anyone had reason to look at you. But he watched. He had always watched. He noticed things. The associate on 17 who kept a half-empty bottle of antacids in his desk drawer and ate lunch at his keyboard. The paralegal on 15 who had been crying in the bathroom on the third Tuesday of every month for at least 2 years. He never mentioned this to anyone, but he always made sure there were extra tissues in the dispenser on the days before. The patterns of conversation in conference rooms, who deferred, who interrupted, who said nothing but shifted the whole room when they finally spoke. Today, as he moved his cart past the glass-walled conference room on the 18th floor, the one they called the Meridian Suite, reserved for high-level client meetings, he noticed the unusual activity. There were floral arrangements on the table, the good water glasses, and a catering setup along the credenza. 3 men in dark suits stood near the windows, conversing quietly in a language that most people in the building would not have recognized on first hearing, but which Nathan recognized immediately: German. Specifically, the precise, slightly clipped register of northern Germany, Hanover region, the dialect considered closest to standard High German, the one taught in business schools and used in formal contracts. The men were discussing something about terms and schedules. The taller one, who wore glasses with thin silver frames, said something about the final clause being a concern. The shorter one laughed softly and said they would see how flexible their hosts were feeling. Nathan continued past the conference room at his usual pace, cartwheels squeaking gently on the tile, and said nothing. He moved on to the restrooms at the end of the corridor. He had been cleaning this building for 3 years. In that time, he had heard snatches of deals, strategies, arguments, and secrets in 4 languages. He had never mentioned any of them to anyone. He pushed his cart into the men's room and began. Margaret Donovan did not think of herself as someone under pressure, primarily because she had spent 15 years training herself to perform competence so completely that pressure had nowhere to grip. She was 44, the youngest CEO in Hargrove Capital Group's 30-year history, and she had taken the chair at the worst possible moment, 18 months into a liquidity problem that the board had described, at various points, as a temporary correction, a manageable rebalancing, and, most recently, in a memo that Margaret was reasonably certain was meant to unsettle her, a situation requiring decisive leadership. The board had a talent for making statements that sounded like reassurances and functioned as warnings. The Kessler-Brandt partnership was the answer to all of it. Kessler-Brandt AG was a German private equity firm with significant infrastructure holdings and a consistent record of identifying undervalued American assets at exactly the right moment. They had been in preliminary conversations with Hargrove for 7 months. The proposed joint venture, a $50 million co-investment framework targeting mid-market manufacturing acquisitions, would immediately shore up Hargrove's balance sheet, provide Kessler-Brandt with the U.S. market access they'd been seeking, and demonstrate to the board that Margaret Donovan was not merely managing a decline, but actively constructing something new. The partnership required, above all, a flawless first meeting. Margaret had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered. Exhaustively. She had read every public filing Kessler-Brandt had ever submitted, studied the professional histories of the 3 principals who would be attending, commissioned a briefing on German business culture and negotiation norms, and hired a professional interpreter, a woman named Sandra Pierce, who came recommended by 2 separate investment banks as the best German business interpreter on the Eastern Seaboard. Sandra Pierce charged $400 an hour. Margaret had authorized it without blinking. The morning of the meeting, Margaret arrived at the tower at 6:30 a.m. She reviewed the term sheet with her general counsel, walked through the conference room setup, approved the catering, and confirmed the schedule with her assistant, a meticulous young man named Derek Holt, 3 times. At 8:15, the Kessler-Brandt delegation arrived. Dieter Vogel, the managing partner, who was tall and wore the silver-framed glasses. Karl Brunn, his deputy, shorter and with a quality of watchful stillness that Margaret had noticed in the best negotiators she'd ever faced. And a younger associate named Felix Werner, who appeared to be there to take notes and learn things. Margaret greeted them at the elevator in German. She had exactly 1 sentence of German, which she had memorized. Herzlich willkommen bei Hargrove. Wir freuen uns sehr, Sie kennenzulernen. She delivered it correctly. Dieter Vogel smiled politely. Karl Brunn nodded. The sentence did what it was designed to do. which was establish goodwill and then immediately run out. They settled into the conference room. Coffee was poured. Derek arranged documents. The catering trays were positioned correctly. Everything was as it should be. At 8:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, Margaret checked her phone for the third time and found no message from Sandra Pierce. At 8:52, she asked Derek to call her. The call went to voicemail. Derek called 4 more times between 8:52 and 9:03. Voicemail, 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 voicemail. The meeting was scheduled for 9. At 9:01, Margaret excused herself from the conference room calmly, the way she did everything in public, and stepped into the small anteroom adjacent, where Derek was already working through his phone with the focused desperation of someone who understands that a problem is now his to solve because it is in front of him. "She's not answering," he said. The sentence contained a particular quality of understatement that Margaret recognized as the beginning of panic being managed. "I know." She looked at the ceiling for approximately 2 seconds. Options. Derek had a list. He'd already tried the interpreter agency they kept on retainer. No one with German fluency available on 2 hours' notice. He'd called a colleague at another firm who had in-house German speakers. But the colleague's assistant had said he was in Boston. He'd found 3 German language professors at the university across the city, none of whom had answered. "There's a language service app." "No," Margaret said. "It might be. For a $50 million contract with a firm that chose us partly because we represent precision and reliability?" "No." Derek closed the app. Through the glass wall of the conference room, Margaret could see the Kessler-Brandt delegation. Dieter Vogel had removed his phone and was examining something on it with the neutral expression of a man who is comfortable waiting and equally comfortable leaving. Karl Brunn was speaking quietly to Felix Werner. Their body language was not hostile, but it had shifted from the warmth of the initial greeting to something more carefully contained. They had flown from Frankfurt for this meeting. They were not accustomed to waiting. One of the junior associates, a young woman named Chelsea Marsh, who had been with the firm for 11 months and was currently completing a project related to the Kessler-Brandt due diligence materials, volunteered that she had taken 2 years of German in college. Margaret looked at her. "How much German?" Chelsea hesitated. "Enough to order food." "Maybe." Margaret turned back to the window. The afternoon light fell across the floor of the anteroom in a long rectangle. And in it, she could see the reflection of the conference room. And in the conference room she could see everything she had built over 15 years either holding its shape or beginning, very slowly, to shift. She had grown up in a household that did not have the option of waiting for someone else to solve problems. Her father had driven a delivery truck. Her mother had cleaned other people's houses. Margaret had been the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university, and she had done it by refusing to acknowledge the possibility that she couldn't. She had carried that refusal through law school, through 2 firms, through 5 positions of increasing responsibility, to this room, on this morning, with a $50 million handshake about to dissolve because a professional interpreter had not picked up her phone. She pressed both palms flat against the wall and breathed. In the conference room, Dieter Vogel set down his phone and said something to Karl Brunn. Karl Brunn glanced toward the anteroom. "Miss Donovan." It was Derek, very quietly. She straightened, turned. In the doorway between the anteroom and the main corridor stood Nathan Calloway. His cleaning cart parked at an angle behind him. He was holding a folded cloth in one hand. His expression was the same as it always was, attentive, unhurried, slightly watchful. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. He looked at Margaret. "I heard some of your conversation. I can help with the translation, if you need it." Chelsea Marsh made a small sound. Derek blinked. Margaret looked at the man in the gray uniform for one long moment. She did not know his name, though he had cleaned the 18th floor for 3 years. "Excuse me?" Derek said. His voice had the precise quality of a person who is not being unkind, but who genuinely needs the statement to be repeated, because the version he heard cannot be the correct one. Nathan didn't repeat it. He waited. Chelsea said, less quietly than she intended, "He's the janitor." Nathan looked at her without particular feeling. Margaret raised one hand, not aggressively, just a small gesture that meant stop talking. She looked at Nathan with the evaluating attention she brought to everything that needed assessing rapidly, and without the benefit of prior data. "You speak German?" she said. "Yes." "Business German? Contract language? Financial terminology?" "Yes." "The people in that room are from Hamburg. They speak formally. Their managing partner is precise about language. I've read his public statements. He notices when people use imprecise formulations." Nathan said, "Ich verstehe. Präzision am Sprachgebrauch ist in diesem Kontext selbstverständlich." The anteroom went quiet. It wasn't just that the words were correct, it was the register, the slight formality, the comfort of a person who is not translating from English in their head but producing the language as its own thing. Margaret had enough linguistic instinct to recognize the difference, even without understanding the content. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said, I understand." Precision in language is a given in this context. Margaret looked at him for another 3 seconds. Derek opened his mouth. Margaret's hand came up again. She had been in enough rooms, made enough decisions, to know that the particular discomfort she was feeling, the resistance to this solution, based entirely on what the solution looked like, rather than what it could do, was exactly the kind of thinking that had kept people like her, father delivering packages until his knees gave out, while other people sat at tables and decided things. "All right," she said. "What's your name?" "Nathan. Nathan Calloway. Mr. Calloway." She straightened her jacket. "Would you give me one moment, please?" She went back into the conference room alone, smiled at the Kessler-Brandt delegation with the full wattage of her professional warmth, and apologized for the brief delay. She explained that there had been a last-minute change, their scheduled interpreter had a family emergency, and that they would be proceeding with a colleague. Dieter Vogel tilted his head fractionally. "A colleague, someone with whom we work closely," Margaret said. "I apologize for the disruption. I want to ensure you have the full context for our proposal today." Karl Brun said nothing. He watched. When Nathan walked into the conference room 90 seconds later, still in his uniform, because there was no time for anything else, the silence that fell was of the particular quality that fills a room when something has violated an expectation so completely that the mind requires a moment to recalibrate. Chelsea Marsh, who had followed at a distance and now stood near the doorway, watched Dieter Vogel's eyes move from Nathan's face to the embroidered logo on his breast pocket and back again. Nathan took the empty chair to Margaret's left, set his hands flat on the table, and looked at Dieter Vogel. In German, he said, "Good morning. I understand you've come a long way for this meeting, and I want to make sure that nothing important is lost between us today. Shall we begin?" The silence held for one more beat. Dieter Vogel looked at Karl Brun. Something passed between them, a flicker of reassessment, private and quick. "Yes," Dieter Vogel said. "Let's begin." It started with the term sheet. Margaret walked the delegation through Hargrove's proposed co-investment structure, the capital allocation model, the acquisition criteria, the governance framework, the timeline for the first deployment. She spoke clearly and with the practiced authority of someone who had spent weeks with this material. Nathan translated in real time, without gaps, without the furrowed concentration of someone working hard to keep up. He wasn't keeping up. He was simply present in both languages simultaneously, the way a pianist is present in both hands, at once, not switching back and forth but occupying the whole instrument. The Hargrove team, gathered around the far side of the table, watched with the careful attention of people who cannot verify what they are witnessing but can feel the quality of it. Chelsea Marsh, who had claimed 2 years of college German, could not follow the specifics but could hear the cadence, the naturalness of it, the absence of hesitation. What they could not fully appreciate, because they didn't have the language, was what Nathan was actually doing. Translation, at its most basic, is correspondence. Finding the word in one language that matches the word in another. But language in negotiation is never operating at its most basic. Every sentence in a high-stakes business meeting carries weight that the words alone do not contain, the weight of relationship, of face, of unspoken assumptions about what the other party values and fears. A translator who only translates words is moving furniture. Nathan was moving the room. When Margaret described Hargrove's track record with manufacturing acquisitions, she used a phrase that was technically accurate, but carried, Nathan recognized instantly, a slightly self-congratulatory undertone that would read poorly to Kessler-Brandt's Northern German sensibility. which prized understatement and was instinctively suspicious of anything that sounded like boasting. He translated the substance faithfully, but adjusted the register, flattening the self-promotion into quiet confidence. When Dieter Vogel described Kessler Brandt's investment philosophy, Nathan recognized a phrase that translated literally, "as we move carefully," which in English would sound either reassuring or slow, depending on tone, and rendered it "as we move with intention," which landed differently, purposeful rather than cautious, which was clearly what Vogel meant. Karl Brunn asked a question about the dispute resolution mechanism. Margaret answered. Nathan translated, then paused for exactly 1 second, not to think, but to allow the room to absorb the answer before Brunn could form his follow-up objection. And in that pause, Brunn nodded, instead of questioning further. These were small adjustments. They accumulated. Halfway through the presentation, Dieter Vogel asked Nathan a question directly. Not about the content of the meeting, but about his background. In German, conversationally, as though the meeting had briefly paused and they were two people talking. "You studied in Germany?" he said. "I lived there for 3 years," Nathan said in German. "I studied at Freiburg for a year before that, as an undergraduate. And I spent 2 years working for a firm that had significant German client relationships." "Which firm, if I may ask?" Nathan told him. Vogel's eyebrows rose slightly. "They closed their international desk in 12 years ago." "Yes." A small pause. Then Vogel smiled genuinely, for the first time since the meeting had begun. "They had very good people," he said. "They did," Nathan agreed. Karl Brunn was watching this exchange with the slightly more open expression of a man who has revised his assessment of the room and not yet decided what to do with the revision. Margaret did not understand the exchange. She waited. Nathan turned to her and said, quietly, "He asked about my background. We have a connection through a firm I worked at before. It's established some trust." Margaret looked at him. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." The meeting continued. The Hargrove associates gradually stopped looking at Nathan's uniform. It came in the 3rd hour. The main structure of the deal had been agreed in principle. The catering had been refreshed. There was a quality of settled warmth in the room that had not been there at the beginning, the particular warmth of people who have moved from the formality of first contact to the more honest territory of actual negotiation. Karl Brunn had been quiet for most of the meeting. He had asked precise questions and listened to the answers, with the focused attention of someone who was not performing engagement, but actually engaged. Now he opened the folder in front of him, found a page near the back, and set it on the table with a deliberateness that everyone in the room recognized as intentional. He spoke in German. It was a long statement. Margaret watched Nathan's face while Karl Brunn spoke. Nathan's expression was attentive, neutral. He let Brunn finish completely before he said anything. Then he translated. The substance was this. Kessler Brandt wanted to revise the profit-sharing structure to give their firm a larger proportion of returns from the first 2 acquisitions, the ones with the lowest risk profile and the most predictable cash and flows, while Hargrove would carry a proportionally larger share of the risk on later, more speculative acquisitions. It was framed as a matter of capital efficiency. It was, in fact, an attempt to shift the risk-reward balance significantly in Kessler Brandt's favor at Hargrove's expense. "That's not what we agreed in the term sheet," Margaret said, keeping her voice even. Nathan translated. Brunn responded. Nathan translated. "He says the term sheet was a framework for discussion, not a binding structure. He says this revision better reflects the actual risk each party is carrying." Margaret looked at the table. Everyone in the room was very still. This was the pivot point. She had been here before. In different forms, in different rooms. The moment when the other party has presented a condition that is unreasonable, and the response will either concede too much or push too hard and shatter the goodwill that has been carefully constructed over the preceding hours. She looked at Nathan. He said, very quietly and in English, "May I?" She hesitated for exactly the amount of time that the hesitation required, and then nodded. Nathan turned to Karl Brunn and spoke in German. The statement took approximately 45 seconds. Nobody on the Hargrove side could follow it entirely. But the quality of it was unmistakable. It was not aggressive, not conciliatory, not defensive. It was precise and grounded, and, above all, calm. Later, much later, Margaret would ask Nathan to tell her exactly what he had said. He had told Brune, "I want to make sure I'm understanding your concern correctly, because I think there may be a different way to look at the same underlying issue. You're worried about risk concentration in the later acquisitions. That's a fair concern. But the reason the current structure is weighted the way it is because Hargrove is taking on more operational responsibility. In the first two acquisitions, they're providing the existing relationships, the regulatory clearances, the on-the-ground management. The return allocation reflects that contribution, not just the risk profile. If you want to revisit the allocation on the later acquisitions, that's a conversation worth having. But revising the first two would need to account for that contribution. And I think when you look at it that way, you'll find the current structure is actually protecting Kessler Brandt's interests as much as Hargrove's, because it means Hargrove has a direct incentive to make those first acquisitions succeed. That alignment is valuable to everyone at this table. Brune listened to this without expression. Then he looked at Dieter Vogel. Vogel looked at the term sheet. A long pause. He turned one page, turned another. He said something brief in German. Nathan translated. He says, "Let's look at the operational contribution clause." Margaret exhaled quietly, not visibly. "Page 12, she said. They went to page 12. 1 hour later, the document looked almost exactly as it had before Carl Brune had placed his folder on the table. One clause had been added, a performance review mechanism at the 18-month mark that gave Kessler Brandt the ability to request a structure review if Hargrove's operational contribution fell below a defined threshold. It was a reasonable safeguard that actually strengthened the framework's long-term credibility. Carl Brune closed his folder. Dieter Vogel said, in German, that he was satisfied. Nathan said, in English, "He's satisfied." The room breathed. The contracts were brought in at 2:17 p.m. by Derek Holt, who carried them with the solemn attention of someone who understands that the papers he is holding represent 3 years of someone else's work and the next chapter of an institution and, though he would not phrase it this way, a kind of vindication. The table had been cleared. The water glasses were freshened. Someone had thought to bring fresh coffee. Dieter Vogel reviewed the final document with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who has signed many contracts and knows that the moment before signing is the last moment that belongs entirely to you, after which the document has a life of its own. He turned each page. He paused twice to ask Nathan a question in German, both times about punctuation-level details in the language of specific clauses. Nathan answered precisely. Vogel nodded and turned the page. Carl Brune signed first, as the deputy authorizing the technical terms. Then Dieter Vogel. He used a pen he produced from his inside jacket pocket, the kind of pen that has been carried for a long time and chosen for permanence. Margaret signed for Hargrove. Her signature was deliberate, legible, the signature of someone who has been told, since early in her career, to make it look like a CEO's signature, and who has quietly made peace with what that means. Derek collected the documents. He distributed the bound copies. He left the room. And then, for a moment, nobody spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence that follows a sustained effort, the silence that falls when the thing you have been working toward has been accomplished, and the reality of it hasn't quite caught up with the anticipation of it. Dieter Vogel stood, and Margaret stood, and they shook hands with the warmth of people who have moved from strangers to something not quite colleagues but at least partners in a specific, defined enterprise. Vogel said something in German. Nathan translated. He says he's looking forward to building something worthwhile together. Margaret said, "So are we." Then Vogel turned to Nathan and spoke to him directly, not as an interpreter but as a person. Nathan listened. His expression did not change, but something in it settled the way a surface becomes still when the wind drops. He said, in English, for the room. He thanks me for the care I took with the language today. He says, it made a difference. Margaret watched Nathan's face. The Hargrove associates, 6 of them arranged along the near wall, most of whom had spent the meeting in the peculiar suspended state of people watching something they don't quite understand, but can feel the significance of, looked at each other, and then looked away. Chelsea Marsh looked at the floor. The man whose German she had not imagined possible stood in his gray uniform with the embroidered logo on the breast pocket. and nodded once. Simply, to Dieter Vogel. No triumph, no performance. Just the nod of a person who has done a thing correctly and is content to leave it at that. Margaret asked him to stay. Not in a performative way. Not loudly. Not in front of the departing delegation or the lingering associates. When the room had cleared and only Derek remained to collect the last of the catering materials, she set her hand flat on the table and said, "Calloway, a moment, if you have one." Derek looked at Nathan, then at Margaret, then found a reason to be elsewhere. They sat across from each other at the long table, in the afternoon light that came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and lay in warm rectangles across the carpet and the backs of chairs. The city was below them, arranged in its particular grammar of glass and steel and motion. "The firm Vogel mentioned," she said. "You worked in international transactions." "I did." "For how long?" "About 6 years. I started as an analyst. By the time I left, I was leading the European desk acquisitions, mostly some advisory work." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had looked at him over the preceding 7 years because she had been at Hargrove for 7 years, though not always on this floor, with the glance of someone whose gaze moves past the uniform to the task it represents and moves on. She was doing something different now. She was actually looking. "Why did you leave?" she said. Nathan set his hands on the table. Outside, a cloud moved across the sun, and the rectangles of light on the carpet shifted and dimmed. "My wife was diagnosed," he said. "Glioblastoma brain cancer. Aggressive. She was 31. He paused. "We had a daughter who was 2. I took leave to manage her care. By the time she died, I'd been out of the field for 18 months, and the desk had been restructured. I could have fought my way back in. But Lily was 3 years old, and I was the only person she had left." Margaret said nothing. There are moments when the right response is not a response, but a stillness that makes space for what has been said to exist without being managed. "I could have found something equivalent," Nathan continued. "A position that used more of what I know, but the hours would have taken me away from her in ways I wasn't willing to accept. She had already lost one parent. I decided that being present mattered more than being impressive." He looked at the table. "So I found work with hours I could control. I could start at 6 and finish by 2:30. Be at the school gate by 3. I could be there for dinner. I could be there for the questions that come up at 9 o'clock when she can't sleep. I could be there." He looked up. "The work isn't complicated, but I chose it. Nobody chose it for me." Margaret had built her career on the ability to read people quickly and accurately. She had been wrong before, had misjudged character in ways that cost her real things. But she was not wrong about this. The man across from her was not performing modesty, or performing sacrifice, or performing anything. He was describing his life with the same precision he had brought to the conference room. "Not more, not less. The colleagues who disrespect you," she said. "In this building. You're aware of it." "Yes. And you've said nothing." "I've had nothing to prove," he said simply. "Until today, I didn't need anyone to know what I know." Margaret looked out the window for a moment. She had grown up with a different version of this calculus. Her parents had worked jobs that required the same invisibility, the same daily performance of not mattering, and she had fought her way out of it with everything she had. She had assumed, in some unexamined way, that the fighting was the only right response. That silence was defeat. She was revising this, sitting across from Nathan Calloway in the afternoon light. "Your daughter," she said. "What is she like?" And, for the first time in the entire day, something in Nathan's face changed, not dramatically, not like a movie, but like a door that has been closed opening just slightly to show a room where there is warmth. "She's 9, he said. "She reads everything. She is much wiser than I was at her age, and is probably wiser than I am now." A pause. "She has her mother's laugh." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "I want to make you an offer," she said. He told Lily that night, after dinner. They had a ritual on evenings when something had happened worth telling. They did the dishes together. Because the dishes were a contained space where conversation could happen without requiring eye contact, which Lily had decided at some point was a better arrangement for serious things. She washed. He dried. The radio played softly on the counter classical. Always, because Claire had liked it, and they had kept the habit. Something happened at work today, he said. I know, Lily said. He looked at her. How do you know? You sound different. She handed him a bowl. Happier, I think. But also, like you're thinking hard about something. He dried the bowl. He told her about the meeting. Not all of it, not the details of the contract or the terms, but the shape of it. The interpreter who hadn't come. The offer he'd made. The hours in the conference room. The contract being signed. Lily listened the way she listened to everything. Fully, without interruption, with the focused quality of someone who is filing everything away. When he finished, she said, Were you scared? No. He thought about it. A little nervous. But mostly, it felt like something I already knew how to do. Like when I do long division, she said. It feels hard. Until it doesn't. Something like that. She handed him another plate. Outside, the city made its usual sounds: traffic, a distant siren, the particular register of a Wednesday evening settling into Wednesday night. The woman you work for, Lily said. She wants to give you a new job? She wants to offer me a position. Something more like what I used to do, helping with international partnerships. Working with clients in other countries. He paused. It would be more money, but, he smiled at the window. She was 9. She had always known when there was a but it might mean longer hours. Different schedule, I don't know yet. Lily dried her hands on her side of the dish towel. She turned to look at him with the considered, level gaze that he suspected she had inherited from her mother but had made entirely her own. Dad, she said, you can do both. Both? Be there for me, and also do the job you're good at. She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has not yet learned to doubt herself completely, which is sometimes the only certainty that matters. I'm 9. I don't need you to give up everything. He looked at her. Also, she said, turning back to the sink, you should get paid correctly. It's weird that you weren't. He laughed, actually laughed, quietly, in the kitchen with the radio playing, and it was the kind of laughter that has something else in it. Something that is not quite relief but is adjacent to it. When did you get so practical? He said. Probably from you, she said. He picked up the last glass and dried it and set it in the cabinet. I'll talk to her tomorrow, he said. Lily nodded, satisfied. She hung up her side of the dish towel with the small final gesture of a person who has settled the matter. He accepted the position on a Thursday. Margaret had prepared for the negotiation with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. A clear offer. A written compensation framework. A description of the role that did not minimize what she was actually asking. She had been specific because she respected him enough to be specific. She wanted Nathan in a senior advisory capacity, focused on European partnerships, with a particular emphasis on German-speaking markets. She had also, because she was Margaret Donovan, and she thought in systems, already spoken to HR about flexible scheduling provisions. When he came to her office, he was still in his uniform. He had come from his morning rounds, which he had completed, because that was the job he was still doing until he was not. She thought this was consistent with everything else she had learned about him. He read the offer letter carefully. He asked 3 questions. About the scheduling flexibility, about whether the role would require travel and on what frequency, and about whether the company had a childcare support arrangement or would consider one. She said yes, no more than 4 trips a year, of no more than 5 days, and yes. He signed. She shook his hand across the desk. Monday? She asked. Monday, he said. He finished his shift, returned his cart to the supply room on the 3rd floor, and left the building at 2:14 p.m., 16 minutes earlier than usual, because the supply room took less time than the 18th floor, and walked to the school to pick up Lily. She was waiting at the gate, backpack straps clutched in both hands, her red hair bright in the afternoon light. Well, she said. Monday, he said. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already decided. Then she took his hand, and they walked. The building continued. On the Monday, Nathan began his new role. He arrived at the 14th floor office suite that Derek Holt had arranged for him, with the conscientious thoroughness of someone making amends through logistics. It was a real office, a window, a desk, a chair, a nameplate that read Nathan Callaway, Senior Partnership Advisor, European Markets. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had stood in doorways of offices like this before. He had stood in worse ones and better ones, at moments more important and less. He had stood in a doorway similar to this one, a long time ago, and turned around and walked away, and he had been right to do it. And the boy he had been then, still present somewhere in him, layered beneath everything that had happened since, would not have been able to understand the path from that doorway to this one. But he understood it. He sat down at the desk. He opened the laptop Derek had set up for him. He looked at his calendar, which already had a meeting with a Munich-based infrastructure fund on Thursday afternoon. In the drawer to his right, he had put one thing. The library book Lily had finished, the collection of world folktales which she had pressed on him this morning, with the insistence of someone who considers book lending a serious transaction. The Slavic one, she had said. With the 3 gifts. Read it. He had not yet, but he would. A month after the signing, Dieter Vogel sent a note to Margaret. It arrived as a formal letter, printed, not emailed, which was consistent with everything Nathan had told her about Vogel's preference for things that had weight. It said, among other things, that the first stage of the co-investment framework was proceeding well, and that Kessler Brandt remained enthusiastic about the partnership. Near the end, there was a paragraph she read twice. I would like to express, separately, my appreciation for the interpreter you provided at our initial meeting. His command of the language was excellent, but more significantly, his understanding of what the language was trying to do on both sides of the table was exceptional. In my experience, this is rarer than fluency. Please pass along my regards. Margaret printed the letter and placed it in the file for the Kessler-Brandt partnership. Then she printed a second copy, folded it, walked down 2 floors, and slid it under Nathan Calloway's office door. 3 weeks after that, a new associate joined the European Partnerships team, a young man named Carter Webb, 26, recently graduated, enthusiastic in the way of people who have not yet had their enthusiasm tested. On his second day, he passed the supply room on the 3rd floor, where 2 members of the facilities crew were on break, and he said something not loudly, not intending to cause offense, that revealed, in the specific and ordinary way that such things are revealed, that he did not think of the people in the supply room as occupying the same category of serious person as himself. He did not finish the sentence. One of the senior associates, a woman named Rachel Voss, who had been in the conference room the day of the signing, put a hand briefly on Carter's arm and said, in a tone that was not unkind, but was absolutely clear, "You should know that the head of our European partnerships team used to work this floor, and he is better at this job than most people twice his age." Carter Webb looked at her. Then he looked at the supply room door. He thought about it for the rest of the day. On Thursday afternoon, he sat in on the Munich call. Nathan ran it efficient, warm, precisely calibrated to the particular rhythm of German business conversation, which rewards patience and is suspicious of eagerness. The deal they were discussing was smaller than the Kessler-Brandt framework, but structurally significant. By the end of the hour, the foundations for a new partnership were in place. Carter Webb took notes on paper, the old-fashioned way, because he had noticed that Nathan did. After the call, as people were filing out, Carter stopped at the door. He looked at Nathan, who was reviewing something on his screen. He said, "That was excellent." Nathan looked up. "Thank you," he said, simply, and turned back to his screen. On a Friday in late autumn, Nathan Calloway left the office at 3:15 p.m. He took the elevator to the ground floor, walked through the lobby past the security desk, past the coffee cart, past the glass doors into the cool air of the street, and turned east toward the school. Lily was waiting at the gate, as she always was, backpack straps in both hands. Her red hair was loose today. She'd lost the band somewhere during the school day, which happened with some regularity, and was never particularly troubling to either of them. "How was Munich?" she said. "Good," he said. "We made some progress. On the infrastructure thing?" Yes. She had taken to asking about his work with the same matter-of-fact interest she brought to her folktales, not performing curiosity. Just actually curious. They walked. The afternoon light was low and amber. The particular light of a city in late autumn that turns ordinary things. Brick walls, parked cars, dry leaves on the pavement, briefly golden before the dark comes. "Dad," she said. "Yeah? Do you think the man in the story was right? The one with the 3 gifts? He gave up the first 2. He thought about this. He used the 3rd one to do what the first 2 couldn't, the quieter one. But he still had to give the others away." "Yeah." She considered this. I think that's okay, she said finally. Giving things up. If you're giving them up for the right thing. He looked at her. She was walking slightly ahead of him, as she sometimes did, her feet finding their path with the easy certainty of someone who trusts the ground. I think you're right, he said. She glanced back at him, smiled quick, private, the smile that was her mother's and hers. I know, she said, and they walked on, through the amber light, through the sound of the city settling into evening, through the particular ordinary miracle of a father and a daughter at the end of a day that had been, in its quiet and unremarkable way, enough.